she works on the history of psychiatry and the history of psychology, and has published very widely many books on this topic, but she's particularly interested at the moment in cross-cultural, transnational psychiatry, and she's particularly been working in Asia, and she has a book, Colonialism and Transnational Psychiatry, which is about Indian psychiatry in 1920 to 1940. But actually, she works across several hundred years, I think, in her research, so from about 1700 to the present day. And her talk today is really about the history of the normal. So I'd like to welcome Professor Waltraud. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm slightly obsessed with how to start off. So there we go. So thank you very much for the introduction, and hello. It's nice of you to turn up, and I hope you are going to enjoy the talk I'm going to give. My brief was to keep it brief, and I will try to do it and stick to the time I have been given. I have worked on the history of the normal for quite a while. I started off exactly 10 years ago when I published an edited collection of papers. And the contributors to that book focused on how social and cultural norms determine our perceptions of what is normal rather than abnormal or pathological. The central issue was, how do we know what is normal or abnormal? Why do we consider one person a perfectly normal chap and another one not quite so? When is a specific sexual practice thought of as abnormal? How come my doctor worries about my abnormally high blood pressure, but I feel perfectly normal and healthy? What I would like to do tonight is to present you some of the approaches that historians, anthropologists, philosophers, and sociologists have employed to answer these kinds of questions. But let us first look at a general dictionary definition of the normal. Until about the middle of the 19th century, the term normal was defined in English dictionaries simply in a formalistic way as standing on right angles. Although no moral prescription appears to be inherent in this seemingly purely mathematical definition, the seed of evaluation and prescription can be discerned. The notion of measurement and measuring, of imposing a standard against which things and people are measured. A norm in this sense of running the rule over someone or getting the measure of them points us to the norm as a standard, a rule or principle to be complied with. This leads us to the modern meaning of the term. The norm as signifying expected forms of social behavior or depictions based on sets of more or less implicit social rules that exist independently from individuals and exercise a coercive influence, with breaches of the norm being subject to sanctions or at least bewilderment. This definition of norms as social norms that refer to conventions of behavior and standards of value is taken as the starting point of analysis by a range of scholars. This definition also fits in with philosophical conventions. These conventions carefully differentiate between prescriptive and evaluative or normative statements, namely that which ought to be, on the one hand, and mere descriptions or statements of matters of fact, namely that which is, on the other. Social norms are important. They signify a standard, a rule, or a principle used to judge or direct human conduct. They act like a highway code and help avoid collisions and disarray. The view of norms as some kind of a good thing has been highly debated, particularly so since the 18th century. Those who consider norms as something constructive and vital for society include the sociologist Durkheim and the philosopher Habermas. They contend that norms, if built on consensus, are necessary for democratic societies. They say that restrictions on individuals' possibly destructive and socially harmful behaviors and inclinations are vital in order to guarantee social cohesion and a good life for the majority. I assume most of you will be familiar with Hobbes's statement that if life was left unrestricted and in its natural state, then it would be full of continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. However, critics of this positive view see norms differently. Norms are imbued with power and the potential for control. To continue the traffic example, we have traffic wardens and police to enforce the rules. Foucault has taught us about issues of power, control, and the subjugation of the abnormal. In this negative reading, norms are intrinsically oppressive and have the tendency to subjugate that which is considered abnormal. For example, you will be issued a parking fine if you have not fed the parking meter. Norms are also open to contestation, negotiation, change, revision, as when there are places where we don't have traffic wardens or even traffic, or there may be a point when they are actually abolished. And finally, norms are context-specific. And at this point, I have exhausted the traffic metaphor, but I provide a different one, namely the metaphor relating to the normal and the abnormal by, and it's actually more than a metaphor, I suppose, by Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas was an anthropologist, and she focused on what was merely a handful of soil in the eyes of some and a load of dirt in the eyes of others. In this view of what is normal and abnormal or out of place, it is the context within which we find a handful of organic matter that is vital for gardeners, but in the wrong place when it becomes disgusting dirt. And in this sense, when it is in the wrong place, it violates the expected norm within a particular context. So dirt in a hospital ward would be abnormal. For Douglas, soil in an operating theatre is not simply a deviation from the norm, or possibly a matter of degree of cleanliness, but a violation of the norm itself. So that is Mary Douglas's view of norms and the normal. Let us now look at a very different approach to the normal and to norms. Currently, about 1 in 4 people in Britain suffer at any one point in their lives from mental illness, or what was previously referred to as insanity. One question is, how do we know that somebody is not sane? One answer that might occur to those involved in mental care is, of course, by referring to the DSM or ICD. But what would reference to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness or the International Classification of Diseases tell us where insanity begins and sanity ends? A psychologist in America by name of Rosenhan asked the question and explored what would happen if completely sane or normal members of his own research team were to admit themselves to 12 different state mental hospitals in 5 states. By simply going there and reporting one of the symptoms that is usually associated with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, namely hearing voices. So what happened? Rosenhan's team members were duly admitted, diagnosed, and although they started immediately on admission to behave normally, they were made to take antipsychotic medication. They stayed on average nearly 3 weeks in the institutions before being discharged. Rosenhan concluded that there are problems about our capacity to distinguish the sane from the insane. The study has, of course, been critiqued. It has been pointed out that far from showing doctors' inability to differentiate the healthy from the unhealthy, they in fact did so. The pseudo-patients were, after all, eventually discharged. What interests us here is that certain behaviors displayed by the pseudo-patients were interpreted by health staff as pathological. One of these behaviors was the pseudo-patient's note-taking in order to keep a log of their observations during the time they were locked up. Now, if we look around this room, I might see some people taking notes, and surely I would not consider these people, members of the audience, as pathological note-takers, but perhaps as interested listeners. Even if those people are merely writing a shopping list because they've got bored so far, nobody would be inclined to put the construction of pathological behavior on them. However, that was exactly what happened within the psychiatric hospitals, which means that our judgments are guided by context. And within a psychiatric institution, certain behaviors are more likely to be interpreted as in line with a patient's diagnostic ascription namely note-taking, as something abnormal rather than normal. Context is also important in regard to an example of how the insane may be regarded within the community. A colleague of mine, an anthropologist from the United States, discovered during her fieldwork in a small Italian town that residents had become used to a mentally ill man who spent his time, most of his days, in the piazza. He was one of those who were discharged into the community in the wake of the deinstitutionalization of the insane and the closing down of mental hospitals. Notions of deviance and abnormality were still applied to the former patient by the town's inhabitants, as he was recognized as a former patient. But his predictable presence in the piazza provided a sense of normality to this community, to the extent that if the familiar madman were to fail to appear one day, locals would notice his absence, and the piazza would take on a sense of unsettling unfamiliarity. We all know about the old-time trope of the village idiot or village madman. During the drive towards deinstitutionalization, some former patients could slip into the role of the deviant who becomes part of the normal local space, becoming acceptable to the community as a deviant whose potentially threatening abnormality is contained in a reassuringly predictable manner. Here we have an example of what Goffman called the normal deviant. Slipping into the role of the village madman made it possible for this former patient to construct a normal life based on an abnormal role. Related to Goffman's ideas about the normal deviant, the sociologist Durkheim too argued in his essay on the normal and the pathological that society needs the abnormal in order to know the normal. For Durkheim, the abnormal and normal go together to the extent that the abnormal is part of the normal. In Durkheim's reading, the abnormal is a referent for what is normal. In other words, the abnormal calibrates the normal. Michel Foucault took up this idea, focusing in particular on the process of the normalization of the abnormal through integration. The deviant or abnormal madman becomes a normal feature of normal life. He is part of or contained in the normal life of the piazza, and hence becomes not only predictable, but also subject to control. The containment of the abnormal in the normal therefore has two very different meanings. There is another definition or understanding of the normal which is based on the frequency of occurrence, namely how common or widespread a particular behavior or phenomenon is. In short, this understanding relates to statistical norms. Statistical norms are arrived at by means of statistical procedures, such as the Gaussian or normal distribution. This is also referred to as the bell curve. The problem with the bell curve is the dangerous temptation to take the core set of data in the middle of a normal distribution as that which also provides a standard or what ought to be the social norm. This implies moving from descriptive data of what is the case to prescriptive or normative statements. The problem of the potential is that there is a potential for the conflation of statistical norms and social norms. Within the field of medicine, for example, there is the possibility of deriving normative guidelines for control of and intervention from statistical averages and probabilities. Let me give you an example. Consider the case of blood pressure. If you look at the bell curve here, it is not clear from the statistical data where the boundary between normal and pathological blood pressure would be. Which blood pressure is to be considered within normal range is subject to debate and not determined by the statistics themselves. This is where risk factors come in, and certain sets of measurements are considered to harbor a higher risk of heart attack, and yet another set an even higher probability of heart attack, and so on. The problem is that individual patients will receive medication on the basis of probabilities based on whole populations, rather than of their actual current status of health and subjective experience. There's also another problem with this. Thinkers such as Foucault and Canguilhem point out that a statistically identified risk of anomaly does not automatically lead to illness, but might merely constitute a variation and even be potentially useful. For example, high blood pressure might be an individual's quite healthy attempt to adapt to a specific situation. Most importantly, though, the downsides of stats-based risk factor assessment and the treatment of risk rather than illness is its impact on a person's identity, when a person who had been happy, content, and apparently healthy hears that she might not be as healthy as she had felt. There's also, dare I say it actually, the risk that rising costs of modern healthcare systems occasion a politicization of risk factors, leading to incentives to turn statistical into political norms. The philosopher Ian Hacking has even suggested that the move from statistical average to the prescriptive statements about what is to be considered normal is the most powerful ideological tool of the 20th century. He argues that the probabilization of the Western world has led to the confusion of the normal or descriptive with the normative or prescriptive. However, the normal and normative are importantly distinct, as it is not the case that what is normal in the statistical sense necessarily represents a standard of value to be complied with. In philosophy, the slippage from the normal to the normative is called a naturalistic fallacy, namely an inference that purports to derive a normative conclusion from purely factual premises. The fallacy is highly problematic not only in the realm of medicine, but also in politics. The title of the philosopher Jürgen Habermas's work, Between Facts and Norms, gives away the concerns raised in his analysis of norms in the development of contemporary democracies. And I would suggest that in the light of political developments surrounding Brexit and the American elections, the need to understand the dangers of slipping from statistical or descriptive norms, such as the number of immigrants, to social norms and to normative guidelines of control and intervention is as pressing as ever. But I will stop here because this is also another session's talk, I suppose. So thank you very much for listening.
Such a fascinating talk and so interesting question that you raised. We've got a couple of moments for questions. Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask? Yeah.
This is an observation, really. I work in mental health myself, and it struck me the first time I heard this. A doctor speaking to a patient recovering from a mental illness. Are you feeling more yourself? And it wasn't the first time that I'd heard that. I heard another doctor speak to a patient say, "Are you feeling more self? I'm glad you're feeling yourself." It made me think, what is the self? And how can we ever reduce the stigmatization of mental ill health when it's seen as being other than the self?
Yeah.
I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I completely agree that there is this splitting going on, that there is an acknowledgement of some part of the behavior you display that is considered abnormal and not part of yourself, but the point would be to integrate the abnormal.
This is a modern phrasing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Implicitly common.
Yeah. It would be important to integrate the abnormal into the normal, to normalize it for the person and to identify and to have a way of living an identity that is healthy and happy and contains some parts that are considered by others perhaps abnormal. But I mean, there's a severe value judgment there, isn't there? By somebody who decides what my identity is supposed to be. And unhappily, it is part of that identity is to be split off, and I'm supposed to retreat to some identity that is acceptable. So yes, there is a slippage in terms of normative. But I mean, that is integral to psychiatry, isn't it? Because the diagnostic manuals stipulate exactly what the symptoms are that are unacceptable. For example, hearing voices is unacceptable. I mean, it may also be painful for the person, but to consider it as something that should be outside the range of experience of that particular person is a normative statement. Why? In some cultures, hearing voices is not quite as abnormal as the DSM classifications would make us believe. Yeah, I agree.
Some cultures, even the idea of a coherent self that can be retrieved would not really make sense, and certainly historically that doesn't always make sense.
Yeah.
So, an interesting question. But I'm very sorry to say we are out of time, but thank you so much for such an interesting talk. Thank you very much.